Hi, I'm Captain Andrea Cameron. I'm a permanent military professor here at the Naval War College. While I've been here over the last 8 years, I've also been detailed to the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, first in their Stabilization and Humanitarian Affairs Office, and then in their Arctic and Global Resilience Office. And that's where they do all of the climate policy making. So for those in TSDM right now, if you think as an 04, 05, 06, you might not be in the Pentagon, or you might not be contributing to the things you're learning about in the interagency process, this lecture tells you a little bit about how your career path might end up in one of these rooms one day. So I'm talking to you today about my contribution as a contributing editor to the 5th National Climate Assessment. So a little background, just so everyone knows, where did this come from? In 1990, Congress passed the Global Change Research Act, which created a little bitty interagency hub called the Global Change Research Program. It exists by that name still today. And why did Congress pass this back in 1990? They wanted to know how the Earth's changing climate was going to affect the United States of America. So they tasked all of these different agencies within the government. And you saw by law, you see the 14 agencies and departments here. However, nowadays it's even more that are contributing to the construction of their different areas of expertise in telling everybody what is the impacts of climate change to the United States. Congress did this almost unanimously. So I kind of put up here the voting record. This was the George H.W. Bush administration in 1990. Senate had 100% vote, and in the House, it was just a simple voice vote. That's how easy it was back in the day. It was not a politicized issue. And that was all 100% across the board, members of Congress interested in this. And what did they want to know? They tasked this interagency hub with saying, all right, use the expertise in the government and use the expertise out of the government, federal and non-federal, bring this together, and we task you every 4 years with making a national climate assessment. Look at different regions, look at different sectors domestically. And then not only do we want to know kind of where it's at, where it's been, what it is right now, but we task you to look out 25 to 100 years in the future. So that's our responsibility as the kind of authors of this report, is to collect as much information as we have, synthesize it together, and then also do our due diligence of saying, you know, if then, this is what it might look like in 75 years. If we make choices about this, this is what it might look like in 100 years. So what goes into this? They want to know important information, science that's translated into kind of information that the public sector can use, the private sector can use, them as policymakers can use, indigenous communities can use, local governments can use. Take all this information, apply your best judgment, and summarize it. It is policy relevant, but never policy prescriptive. What am I saying? I'm saying that no political appointee in particular can contribute to this. This document does not reflect any particular political administration in the government. I got brought into the project because the person who was doing it before me from the Department of Defense ended up being a deputy assistant secretary. They said, we need a new person because that is now a political appointment and they don't qualify to be in the construction of the National Climate Assessment anymore. They want to know the range of impacts. And I'll just give you a little background. This is a multi-year process. So for this one, the National Climate Assessment 5 that was published in 2023, we started it in 2019. So it takes 4 years of intergovernmental work and engagements to come up with this document. We went through 14 drafts. That is, we write something and it goes out for public review. And we get comments back and we write something more and it goes out for interagency review. And then it goes out for the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Medicine, the National Academy of Engineering. All of them get a chance to review our iterative writings of this document and provide their input. And then we make the choices of what gets in, what gets out, and we have to document everything. Everything is publicly accessible about the decisions we make over the multi-year process. So 14 different drafts of this document, and it's very intentionally transparent. That's what we want. We want the public to know what we're doing at every step of the way. how do we characterize particularly our key findings? And you will see this language in any intelligence or scientific report. You're looking at the confidence that you have in the information you're sharing and the likelihood. So how do we name our confidence? We kind of have this spectrum of very high and high. And that's where you're like, you know what? Almost all the evidence we're looking at tells us that we're pretty confident in this statement that we're making. We also have medium. You might see that because if there's different schools of thought about, making those 50 years from now, it might look like this. We might have medium confidence because we don't know what decisions we'll make along the way that will give us that result. But most things that make it in the report, because you have limited words, are very, very high and high in the confidence. And the other one is likelihood, virtually certain, very likely, and likely. So that'll take you up to how likely is this? About 66% to 100%. And we're not going to put it in the report unless we're very sure of the likelihood of what we're putting in as content. You'll see that in intelligence reports and stuff. So if you're talking about that in TSDM, that's an important way of how the intelligence community talks and shares information. If they ever tell you they're 100% sure of something, don't believe it for a second, and they probably won't do that. They're talking in confidence and likelihood. That's their language. All right, for the 5th National Climate Assessment, you can see here the list of the chapters. There are 32 of them. 31 of them look domestically, inside the United States and its territories. One chapter looks internationally, and that's the chapter that I was on. So I have that highlighted here. For the next National Climate Assessment, I'll talk about that just a little bit. So for NCA 6, we've already started. It will be out 2027, 2028. And they have pulled the national security piece out of the international chapter and made it a standalone chapter. So that's a very exciting development. So now we'll have the international chapter looking outward and a national security chapter that's looking both externally and internally to the United States. What are some of the main takeaways from the 5th National Climate Assessment? First, the United States is taking action on climate change, and there's vignettes about this throughout the entire document. It's happening at the local, state, and national level, that there's all kinds of policy and private sector decisions that are happening, taking into account climate change. Back in 1990, I'm leading up to the second point here. Back in 1990, this was largely considered a future issue, but the key takeaway from this document was we've now left that behind. We are no longer talking in the future tense. We see the impacts of climate change all over the United States and its territories happening right now. And the final key main takeaway from the National Climate Assessment in all of the chapters is climate action is an opportunity for a more resilient and just nation. So that's not just speaking in terms of the United States, but all communities and countries around the world are going to be making decisions about what to do with this. And as they make those decisions, you can make them in all kinds of ways, but what the goal is to make you more resilient and more just. So that was kind of the other main takeaway that permeated throughout the document. So that was the document as a whole, all 32 chapters, main takeaways. Let's transition. You're dying to ask. Go ahead.
Can you expand upon what you mean by just in this context?
It's typically used in government terms as making decisions that, to the best of your ability, do not impact communities that are already being disenfranchised. You're making decisions that either can bring them in so that, the rising boat lifts all, rising tide lifts all boats. So you're making decisions with that in mind. That's what all government documents are tending to use, how they're using the word just. All right. Chapter 17 is climate effects on US international interests. So you can see, if you're in TSDM today, you're looking at the interagency and the bureaucracy. So I'll just show you that it's a team of State Department who has the federal coordinating lead author, which makes sense. This is, this is the only outward facing chapter. And we have U.S. Agency for International Development, Millennium Challenge Corporation, NOAA, Department of Defense, and Interior, and then a variety of civilian scholars and private industry that all contributed to this particular chapter, just this one. So there's 500 authors in plus for the entire document. Why does this, what am I showing you? One, it makes sense that State Department is leading the international one. The other piece is for the next national climate assessment where we have a standalone national security chapter. I am no longer a chapter author. I'm now the federal coordinating lead author. So it's been really fun in the first part of developing this next report, making the decision on who the chapter lead is and which departments get to come in and contribute to this national security climate change intersection. So if you have questions about the next one, I'll be happy to answer them. But this is going back to this one. Chapter 17 had 4 key messages. The first one was about interdependent systemic climate-related risks increasingly affect U.S. interests. And that's kind of a broad one. I'll talk about that in a little detail just so you can see how we put it together. Key message 2, climate change exacerbates national security. That's the one I worked the most on. Key message 3, climate change presents risks and opportunities for U.S. economics, trade, and investment. Very, very important, but I'm not going to talk about it much today. And the final one was climate change undermines sustainable development. Those were our 4 key messages, but I'll go into key message 1 just a little bit so you can see what we were thinking. In a globally connected world, climate change impacts on U.S. interests are multifaceted, interconnected, and frequently exacerbated by social unrest and environmental degradation. And you can see here where we use that kind of intelligent science clarification of we think that's likely, and we've valued that as high confidence. The scale and speed of climate-related impacts to U.S. interests are expected to increase, due in part to underlying interdependencies and the projected intensification of climate change. Emerging systems and scenario-based approaches to integrative planning are being applied to account for interdependencies and competing priorities. One of the biggest and most easiest things to do, because climate change is a vast thing, is to break it out into a piece. I'm looking at water, I'm looking at heat. But the really important thing to understand about this is kind of looking at it, one system affects another system, because none of these things happen in a vacuum. So our key message was really trying to paint that picture about the interconnectedness of the systems and therefore then the implications to national security, economics, and sustainable development. So that was kind of a foundation. But the graphic in there kind of shows that in a nice tight picture. So just to orient everyone on the figure that went with key message 1, when you're talking about understanding your climate risk, you might look at the left column over here. So you have the climate hazard itself, a drought, a hurricane, and then you have the compounding stressors, like land degradation or poverty, or some of those other kind of social or physical factors that kind of hit the climate hazard. Then there's a third piece, and you'll see that at the bottom list on the left side, adaptive capacity. So if you take the hazard, you take your other compounding vulnerabilities, and then you take the government's ability to respond to it. Those things combined, that's kind of a generic formula to say, this is our collective understanding of our climate risk. And that's a pretty common formula. So that's the left side. Down the middle, you have our 3 key areas that the international chapter focused on. But I'll just point out on the left side of those bubbles, you'll see the risks. But one thing we as authors in all of the chapters have to do is also say, these are the opportunities. A lot of changes are going to happen, and we have to think about how we can manage the changes by understanding the risk and taking the opportunities that are presented to us. And then finally, on the right, you see the 2 most common levers when you're talking about there's climate change and what can we do about it. One is, in order of the thing, mitigation. We have the heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. We want to put less heat trapping gases in the atmosphere so it doesn't continue to warm. And the second is adaptation. we know there's heat trapping gases. We know the Earth system is changing. What do we have to do in our physical systems and our social systems to adapt to that and increase our overall resilience? So those are the two key levers, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But that kind of closes out the key message one, interconnected systems, and it was the foundation for the other three key messages in this chapter. And now I get to go to content, national security, which you all came here to learn more about. So I'll read it to you and walk you through just a little. Climate change can contribute to political and social instability, and in some instances, conflict. You can see here that on the conflict spectrum, we took a low to high approach of the threats, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. It impacts the operations and missions of defense, diplomacy, and development agencies critical to the US national security. When there was a first international chapter in the fourth assessment, it really looked at national security only through a DoD lens. But it's very important to think, when we think of national security and US interests abroad, to take a broader approach of how we are affected. So that was very important for us to take that 3D approach. Often around here, you learn the DIME, defense, information, military, diplomatic, information, military, and economic. 3D is another way to look at your foreign policy approach. And finally, the US government bilaterally and in collaboration with international partners is increasingly addressing these implications through a range of diplomatic development and defense responses. We were allowed to say this was very likely and high confidence because it's what we're actually doing across the US government in our foreign policy. So you could say, yep, we with high confidence, and we can say that. So that is our key message, and I'm going to drill down into some of the content of the national security chapter. Hopefully, I don't know, take that back. This is not from the national security chapter. The intelligence community was tasked with writing the first ever solely dedicated national intelligence estimate just for climate change. And they had to do that in 2021. And when they did that, they're looking externally. They're looking at all of the different ways that there's risk involved in the international community based on climate change. And this was a table that the 18 different groups of the intelligence community came up with and used their expertise to kind of categorize the risk: none, low, medium, and high. And they did it for, looking at 2021 when the report was published, 2030, and 2040. We as authors are saying, how do we capture as much information as we can into the limited words that we have? And a table that the intelligence community created is a really great way to convey a lot of information in a short amount of space. So we started with what the intelligence community published in 2021, and then we took it and adapted. Very important to note here, at no point did we as the authors say, we're just going to change their risk assessment. They put a lot of thought into it. They're the experts. So we left all of the substantive work of their risk assessment intact, but just reformatted it for our own narrative. So this is what you did read. This is the table that was in the National Climate Assessment. And you'll see you can see it's more like a stoplight chart. That was not my input, just to note. But we took, and especially reverse the order of things. Our narrative is that we look at instability from low to high. So if you see the top category, it's climate effects impacting country level instability. And then another kind of larger scale threat, geopolitical flashpoints, and then geopolitical tensions. You'll see here what wasn't in the report, which is kind of these red and blue arrows off to the side. And this is what's not obvious to everyone if you're just reading it, getting ready for class, or curious about the content. But we as the authors have to say, okay, so if that's our kind of laundry list and starting place, what part of it do we actually write more about? What gets a couple more sentences? What gets a whole paragraph? What gets another graph? So that's what the arrows kind of represent, is where we kind of pulled that thread a little bit more in the rest of the document. So I'll start with the two smaller arrows first. because we definitely wanted to identify them. The greater demand for aid and humanitarian relief. We knew that was happening already in all sectors. The requests were coming through diplomacy, our development and our defense apparatus were both being engaged for humanitarian relief. And then strain on military readiness. So both of those pieces got a couple extra sentences saying that's an important part that we want to kind of pull out of this chart and mention and talk about. What I'm going to spend more time on is the 4 big arrows, because those got a lot more attention in the report. We said if we're talking about what we think is important, you can see by the number of words we've dedicated. So the first one up at the top, internal insecurity and conflict. It was really important for us to note from this low to high spectrum of conflict that we recognize internal instability can happen, and you kind of want to address issues as local as you can. But in local can become national, can become international issues, and we recognize. This can have a disparate impact on particularly marginalized communities, so we identified that as well. And finally, it's often it's not directly causal, but a lot of people think of the relationship between climate change and conflict. And you see, if you're with climate security scholars like myself and my colleagues, we kind of try and map this out a little in like, what are the steps along the way? The climate change might impact the conflict, but there's this inverse relationship as well. If you are experiencing instability and conflict, it makes it so much harder for you to actually go towards your adaptation goals and your mitigation goals, you as a country, you as a local community. So all of those were pieces that we drew out of this instability note from the chart. The second red arrow is cross-border migration attributed to climate impacts. We felt we just could not get through a report talking about national security without talking about migration. It's the oldest adaptation strategy there is for anything that can get up and move when they don't have a hospitable environment anymore. People, animals, that's what they do. It's very natural. And it's what you're seeing around the world in our ecosystem. So we talked about that, but what do people generally do? It's generally kind of local. You go as far as you can. You don't want to you stay where you're at as long as possible, which takes a lot of your resources. And then you kind of go where you're comfortable with. So you might go to a neighboring county, you might go to the urban environment. If it gets even worse, you might go to a neighboring country. And if you're really looking for a new change, you might go further than that and cross continents. So that was kind of the narrative we had when we were talking about migration. It's natural, it's expected, and there's no reason to think that it won't continue and possibly increase. The third large red arrow is what the intelligence community called ungoverned unilateral geoengineering. Geoengineering is, I told you about adaptation and mitigation. Lowering your greenhouse gases is mitigation. Adaptation is building your infrastructure to absorb that. Geoengineering is intentionally hacking something in the Earth's atmosphere so that you're actually not taking in particularly additional solar radiation. The heat trapping gases and the natural input from the sun is what warms the planet. So if you think about some of the things you might have seen in the news, everything from mirrors in space to sulfur injection into the stratosphere, marine cloud brightening, or making your ice caps whiter, anything that reflects more of the sun out goes into this geoengineering category. Now let's go back to the intelligence estimate. Unilateral, one country decides to do it on its own, mess with the Earth system, and 2, ungoverned. There's absolutely no governance in this space. And that's why the intelligence community was looking at it. And of all the things, if when you started in 2019, this was very unlikely to happen, to 2023, where it was like, this is happening with private sector, states, cities, philanthropic groups are all starting to experiment in this space. So if I were saying Andrea Cameron's opinion right now, this is the area that has changed the most over time. We've known for years and decades and probably millennia that migration was a natural adaptive strategy. Geoengineering technology makes a lot of those things possible, and it's moving very rapidly. So if a country does that, we don't know the technological implications, we don't know the social implications, political implications, legal implications, because there are none, and the ethical implications, because you're now interfering with the atmosphere, not only perhaps over your country, but your neighbors, and this is a global system, so possibly other regions around the world. So we identified that, and you can see how that might correspond with other national security issues or instability or vulnerability and create a national security issue. And the final red arrow, competition with China in key minerals and clean energy technologies. It hit the news this week for anyone who noticed. So we spent a lot of time on this in our chapter on national, or in our piece on national security. And we came up with one graph that we tried really hard to put every possible data point in one graph and make it understandable. Let me explain it. First, we know we have a net import reliance on most minerals and critical metals and critical minerals. We took the critical minerals and metals that were essential for the energy transition. So you see across the bottom that, there was some application to this mineral for wind and solar storage and all. So we just kind of narrowed that list of minerals to things that were important to the energy transition. And then we looked at where those resources were around the world. So I'll just give you kind of a really easy example that most of you are probably more familiar with. If you look at South America, lithium. It's a purple line. It's about energy storage. It's in all of our batteries around. There's probably 100+ devices in this room right now. We know we are dependent on lithium coming out of South America. The other piece of this is just where those minerals are in the world, and we know we're reliant on it. We also know that China has a lot of the minerals within their country themselves and has the majority of the processing of all those minerals, no matter where they come from in the world. But that's not necessarily captured on this graphic. So reliance on these minerals in general, where they come from, and particularly our dependence on China doing all the processing of them is something that we really flagged in our national security chapter. And I personally think we'll see more of that going forward as well. All right, what didn't I cover? These blue arrows over here. So one is the miscalculation over strategic competition in the Arctic leading to conflict. A colleague of ours, Rebecca Pincus, who used to work here, she worked on the Arctic chapter, and they talked about that a lot. So we didn't have to. So we let them take that. And then this other one down at the bottom, developing countries' demands for financing and technology assistance. This is a key issue at every COP, which the most recent one just finished. Developing world is trying to get money out of the developed world for adaptation, for loss and damage. So that's talked about, but again, not in our chapter. That's some of the content. As I mentioned, if you're interested in Arctic security issues, I refer people to chapter 29. And if you're interested in the kind of compounding nature of events, they had a special little kind of section, focus area on that. If you're interested in your hometown or where your next base is, there's regional chapters for all areas of the US and their territories. And then finally, if you just are more curious about the two big levers, adaptation and mitigation, they have in-depth chapters on both of those. So that is an overview of the 5th National Climate Assessment, particularly my involvement in Chapter 17 and the National Security section.